interested in all things psychology? You are at the right place. Here, we bring exciting and thought-provoking ideas. We travel into our minds and some things out of this world. Welcome to the Psychology Debrief.
Hi, and welcome to the Psychology Debrief. Today I'm joined by PhD candidates Isaac Halstead. Isaac does work on people's attitudes towards biotechnology, including people's attitudes towards the COVID-19 vaccines. I'm also joined by Lloyd. Alex does work on why adolescents seek novel and potentially risky behaviors, but has also done some work on COVID-19 during the pandemic. I'm pleased to have both of you here. How are you doing?
Oh, pretty good.
Yeah, good, thanks.
I can see you're both working from home, which is a kind of, I guess, a sign of the times that we're in. I've actually come in for the first time in a long time because my internet is not so stable at home as it is here on campus. So before we actually get started today, I think that it was maybe best to try and set a bit of a backdrop to what's been going on for the past 18 months. So unless you've been under some sort of rock, we've been in the midst of a pandemic, one that has not happened ever before in our lifetimes, and probably most people's lifetimes around the world. And I just pulled some statistics from Johns Hopkins University before sort of coming onto this call, just so we had a bit of a backdrop to understand the kind of severity of the problem that we've been facing worldwide. So to date, and obviously this is going to probably become heavily redundant as a statistic by the time this actually comes out, there have been 184 million cases of the coronavirus worldwide. And that has culminated in almost 4 million deaths, a really sobering number of individuals who have unfortunately passed away. On a more positive note, Johns Hopkins University also provides recordings or statistics for the number of people, or the number of vaccine doses rather, that have been currently administered worldwide. And they have this down as 3.2 billion vaccine doses worldwide. So that's a kind of shining light in the very bleak times that we've been living in. We should probably note that that's double. Obviously, most people need a double dosage. So that doesn't necessarily reflect the number of people that are fully vaccinated against the virus. And again, we don't necessarily know how well the vaccine will hold up against variants. And that's obviously something that goes beyond our research areas, but certainly is an interesting thing to pay attention to in the future. Obviously, the UK is almost hopefully going to be coming out of this crisis in the near future. On July the 19th, we're supposed to be lifting restrictions, but obviously, although things may be looking a little bit brighter in the UK, there are many countries worldwide where the crisis is still very, very deep. And our thoughts go out to those who are going to be struggling for a very considerable future with COVID-19. Obviously, we mentioned that the vaccine is one way that offers us a route out of this virus, but obviously today what we're going to be talking about is the psychology of COVID-19 as well, and the kind of research that you guys have done, as well as a little bit of research that I've done too, that can illuminate on the role that psychology plays in this crisis. And I think one best place to start is if we go back in time, right back to what seems like a very, very long time ago now, sort of beginning of sort of March 2020, when all this news about this virus was coming out, and you went to the store and you couldn't find toilet roll. I remember pasta and rice also being things that were incredibly scarce, a lot of panic buying going on. And I think, Alex, you've done some research on kind of factors that drove this panic buying. So I don't know whether you're happy to speak about, I think you worked on a kind of what's called a foraging model. So if you don't mind just explaining what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, I think one of the things that really marked the beginning of the pandemic for a lot of people was the fact that we suddenly saw panic buying. And panic buying is really interesting because the term itself is best used to describe behavior that people are purchasing more than they usually would, but actually there's no supply scarcity. There was actually no situation where, at least at the beginning, there was actually a shortage of goods. And so I think that's really why panic buying became quite interesting, because at no point during the pandemic did we stop being able to get access to goods. It was people's behavior that seemed to become quite irrational. So we did some work into trying to understand the psychological factors that were motivating this panic buying. And we drew on what's known as animal foraging theory. And what this theory really sort of tries to encapsulate is how people seek resources from their environment. Now, the way that I try and usually explain this is that bees forage all the time for pollen. So if you see bees going around to different flowers, they're trying to collect pollen from each flower. And so they can spend longer at each flower trying to collect the pollen from that particular flower bud. But at some point, it's going to make sense for them to try and travel elsewhere because there's not going to be any pollen left or very little left. And so this is how all kinds of animals forage for resources, us included. So when we were hunter-gatherers, we really had to pay attention to our environment to think about how we were going to collect resources, whether those were berries, might be meat, but essentially everything that would help us to survive and adapt to our surroundings. So what's really interesting about the whole panic buying situation is that it does actually tap into this foraging instinct that we have. And so when you're foraging, you need to be aware of how bounteous or how much resources there are in your environment. And actually, this is a really important tool for us to be able to do, is to know when we should go and travel to find somewhere new. And what we essentially argued in this paper is that when panic buying started, it was because people started to realize, or started to believe anyway, that the average amount of resources that they had available to them, whether or not this was toilet paper, this was pasta, rice, etc., they actually started to think that this was falling in surplus or in quantity. So people started thinking, well, actually, now's time to really hoard, because hoarding actually does make sense in crises. So in Japan, for example, which is an earthquake sort of on the risk for having earthquakes quite frequently, they actually recommend keeping about 2 to 3 weeks of food in storage. So there is like a rational basis for this. However, what became irrational was that people started paying attention to these scarcity cues, and it tapped into this foraging instinct, which meant that they started to panic buy more. So what we did is we tested individual differences that might make people more susceptible to this scarcity effect. And what we found is there were some really interesting individual differences. So there were things related to like age and gender that we found predicted more panic buying. So I think it was in particular younger people were panic buying more than older people. But we also found things like paranoia. So how much people were susceptible to beliefs of other people being out to get them or not necessarily trusting others. That was actually associated with more panic buying. And so it kind of makes a bit of sense. You can kind of imagine that, people that think that others aren't necessarily going to be, trustworthy or for the common good would be more likely to try and hoard resources and try and buy more stuff in because they think that actually there's going to be a scarcity of those items. And we also found something which I think is particularly interesting, is that more people who had more trust in their neighborhood or had more neighborhood belongingness actually were more likely to panic buy. And so I think this also taps into that scarcity mechanism, because what I think happened there was that actually people were hearing more about panic buying from their neighbors because they were talking more to their neighbors. And so for example, you can imagine coming home one day and, your next door neighbor goes, oh God, we've been down to the shop. There's, no toilet paper, no pasta. And that then, lodges a little thing in your head thinking, well, actually, there are fewer things available for me to go and get. Best get down to the shop as soon as possible. So we found some really interesting kind of mechanisms. And we think this foraging framework really ties it all together as to how we can actually explain why people started panic buying. And, obviously, I think the key take-home message is that actually making sure that we've got consistent public messaging about the fact there isn't going to be that scarcity is one way to avoid that. And I think it's something that we might see, unfortunately, happen again. I know that with Brexit, there's certain worries about scarcity because of lorry drivers. In the US, there's recently a massive surge to get gas because they were running out of petrol. So I think there are definite implications for this whole foraging framework to understand panic buying in several domains.
And so when you say these scarcity cues, I'm just wondering, I guess in one sense, the scarcity cue is the direct nature that you can see that the shelf is blank, you don't see it. That suggests to you that in part, that there is a lack of supply for a certain product, like toilet roll, for example. But I guess other scarcity cues, because I think you mentioned, obviously, one possibility is that if you get along with your neighbors and you talk to them, that they might indirectly infer to you that there is a short supply. Or, for example, if you hear the Prime Minister mention, don't need to do these things, that might also imply that there is a scarcity. So there's a level of directness and indirectness to that effect. Is that the case? Yeah,
absolutely. So I think, like you say, I think the news obviously plays a large part of that. And I think that also, just seeing that directly, I think they all kind of culminate together. And I think that's why there are certain things that you can try and mitigate. You can sort of say to news agencies, don't emphasize that there is panic buying going on, because whether or not that is the case, that's going to make people attend to these scarcity cues. But yeah, I think then obviously, there are more direct things such as, going to a local supermarket and then seeing the actual lack of availability.
Sure. And did you identify any factors, I think you mentioned a few already, that might make people more or less prone to panic buying? So I think you mentioned already the idea that if you are sort of talkative with your neighbors and embedded in your community, you're more likely to panic buy. But were there any other kind of factors that drove people not necessarily just the panic buying, but are there any kind of preventative factors that could also lead towards reduced panic buying, for example?
So actually, interestingly enough, so we had this cognitive reflections task, and I think Isaac, you know a little bit about this as well, because I always explain this, but it's
the ball.
Yeah, you get these questions that, like, intuitively it seems like there's a really obvious answer, but actually when you think about it a little bit more, they're like really like subtle things that you need to think about in a little bit more detail. And people that tend to have this deeper level of reflection, Isaac, correct me if this is wrong, right or wrong, but people have this like deeper level of sort of like reflection on the particular question. They actually tend to be more resistant to panic buying. They don't tend to engage it as more, and I think that's probably because they do have this kind of reflection that actually, you know, there isn't going to be such a surplus. There are mechanisms in place to stop people from, you know, being left without all sorts of resources. So I think that was one of the things, another interesting thing we found that actually prevented people from panic buying.
Just to verify that, the task itself, for anyone who's listening, is you get like 3 questions, and an example of them is a bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1. How much does the ball cost? Everyone automatically goes 10 cents for the ball, but that's the incorrect answer, but it's the obvious answer. And then you have to kind of apply a little bit more thought to it and then go, oh, it's actually 5 cents for the ball, because the bat will be $1.05, the ball will be 5, that adds up to $1.10. It's a great one to catch people out, because it's just your automatic thinking.
No, that's great. I think that's really useful to clarify. I was just wondering whether the kind of measure that you're talking about is sort of similar to scales like rational and analytical thinking versus more of an intuitive mindset. Is that what we're sort of getting at here with this kind of bias?
Yeah. Sorry, Alex, right? Because I've done a bit on like decision-making styles and stuff.
You feel it as it's
so yeah, CRT scores do relate to intuitive decision making, positive as in negatively. So the more intuitive you are, the more you go with your gut feeling, the worse you'll perform on these tests. But the more vigilant decision maker, the more kind of I'm going to wait and receive information before making a decision, improves or generally correlates positively with your score on the cognitive reflection test. So yeah, it's all part of this weird nexus of like decision making, intelligence, and yeah.
Great, really interesting stuff. And just to kind of carry on with the foraging idea, I think also in your paper, Isaac, you mentioned that personal risk is another reason that may or may not drive people towards panic buying. Was that the case?
Oh, I think that's for Alex.
Oh, sorry, Alex. Alex,
sorry. More about panic buying than
I get people's names confused.
No. So we also kind of relate this to like this risk of predation is what we call it. And so if you think that you're more at risk of getting coronavirus and also at greater risk of having sort of more like serious outcomes, so, you know, if you're in a clinically vulnerable group, or if you're someone that, you know, maybe looks after an elderly person, actually that kind of plays into what we'd say in kind of the foraging world of things is your risk of predation, because although the virus itself isn't a predator, it acts in the same way that it can actually sort of, you know, debilitate and, you know, affect you quite negatively. So people who perceive themselves at greater risk of COVID, again, if this was going back to, you know, foraging times and you know, hunter-gatherer times, this would make a lot of sense for people to actually hoard when there is that risk of predation. But it's when it sort of plays into this more modern kind of consumer environment that it becomes a bit awry, because actually there is no need, there is no pressure, there isn't that same predation, but there is, you know, rational mechanisms that kind of make people more likely to panic buy. And you know, so I think really the kind of key message is that, you know, they all tap into rational mechanisms, but they're just applied to a situation where they weren't completely necessary, i.e., you know, in a very industrialized nation where we've got quite a good supply of goods coming in.
Sure, and I assume that some of this may also therefore explain people's decisions to engage or not engage in sort of health preventative behaviors. So, for example, we've already talked a little bit about people's personal risk to the virus, and obviously, you know, we are aware of statistically some people are more at risk to the virus than others, but obviously from a psychological point of view, we can all vary to the extent that we think we are personally vulnerable. So do you think some of this foraging model and some of these kind of evolutionary mechanisms can help understand why maybe people engage in social distancing or hand washing or maybe using face masks? Does it apply that way as well?
I don't know about the evolutionary mechanisms as much, but we've recently done some work on a slightly different task. So we've used that same foraging task. So we have like a lab-based task that we get participants to complete online, obviously, because everyone's working from home now. But we have this foraging task, and we can actually use this task to pick apart certain mechanisms about how people make decisions. And so one of the things that we look into is how much people use recent information to make decisions from. So the way that I always think about this is that, say, for example, it's a Friday evening and you're planning to go out on Saturday, or you've got a spare day on Saturday, you're thinking what you're going to do. Now, if I was someone who would base my decision about tomorrow's weather, thinking, am I going to do something indoors or something outdoors? If I was to base my decision on Friday and Friday only, I'd be the sort of person that really weighs recent information highly. I'm relying on the most recent information available to me, i.e., today's weather. But if I was someone who used a wider range of information, I might think, well, how's this week been? Monday was a bit rubbish, but Tuesday was better, got better again on Wednesday, but then Thursday was a bit worse. And actually, if I was to take into account a wider range of information, I'd be someone who would update a lot slower as to recent information. So I'm not using just Friday, I'm using the entire week. And we actually used this foraging task, and we picked apart how people used recent versus more historic information. And we actually found that people who were slower at updating their beliefs were less likely to engage in social distancing, and they were more likely to violate the lockdown measures that we saw in the first lockdown. And so I think we tried to make the argument that actually this kind of casts people that broke lockdown in a different light. It's not the case that they were actively going and trying to break the rules. It's that actually they were relying on more historic information. They were relying on pre-pandemic information and the way that they kind of treated social distancing or their behaviors beforehand. So actually we kind of make this argument that it's because people are relying on pre-pandemic information is why they're engaging in sort of what we call lockdown violation behaviors. So going out, seeing friends, gathering in groups. It's not that they're actively engaging in rule infractions. It's just that they've not updated their sort of decision-making fast enough in relation to the recent information from government. But yeah, and then we also sort of tried to take this from a different tack where we looked at delayed discounting, which is how much people prefer immediate rewards versus delayed one. And so a classic example of this is if I said to you, would you prefer £10 an hour or £30 in 2 weeks? I don't know, Isaac, Sam, what would be your preference for that?
Oh, definitely 30 quid.
Yeah, I would take that as well.
Fair enough. Well, so you are people that are less steep delayed discounters. You're willing to sort of, wait for the larger reward. But actually, there's a lot of people who would go for the £10 right now.
Well, I mean, I'm only saying that because I've just recently got my student finance money, so
That's a really important point. I mean, it does play into socioeconomic status quite a lot. And I think that is a really interesting thing. But we did find that actually people who had this preference for the immediate reward and were kind of considered more impulsive, they were actually less likely to follow social distancing as well. So we actually found there was these two separate cognitive mechanisms that predicted people's social distancing behaviors. So people who basically wanted the rewards here and now of seeing their friends were less likely, also people who were steeper delayed discounters, so preferred immediate rewards, were more likely to say, actually, I don't care about the future. Well, not that they don't care, but they're placing less emphasis on the rewards that can be sort of gained by social distancing, like eventually easing the restrictions, but they were placing the emphasis on the immediate reward of say seeing friends, doing something social right now. So that's kind of two ways that we've kind of used these tasks and the foraging framework, but also, the delayed discounting side of things to think about actually why do people socially distance? There are other factors as well. There is age that plays a factor. Younger people are more likely to break social distancing rules, but I think these cognitive mechanisms do also play a role in that as well.
And so in regards to the first finding you mentioned about how people haven't necessarily updated their kind of beliefs in the pandemic, so they're using their sort of prior existing kind of beliefs about how to behave, would that be kind of fairly compatible with, because I've done some research on whether people would engage in social distancing or not, and as well as things like face mask use, and what I've found in that data is that people often maybe show an unrealistic sense of optimism about their personal vulnerability to the virus. Does that kind of also, their beliefs are not necessarily just updating about certain behaviors, but also their own personal level of risk, because prior to the virus, they probably were, obviously generally more safe in life to go about these things. Does it cover kind of both kind of levels of beliefs or just one particular type?
No, I mean we don't have the data to say like to have support for that or not, but that makes complete sense to me. And actually, I know that younger people are more hesitant towards getting the COVID vaccine, and it might tap into similar mechanisms where actually they might be less likely to be getting the vaccine, or might just underestimate their personal risk because actually they've not updated their views of what the COVID pandemic is in relation to their own health as quickly as some other people have. So no, I think that does actually make a lot of sense. I think that would be definitely something that would be really interesting to look into actually.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's certainly a lot of interest and scope to understand, why people aren't, following these kind of rules. And I think you mentioned a good point that we can often maybe assume it's just negligence, but sometimes it can just be, people haven't appropriately updated their sort of belief systems just yet. But you did mention vaccine hesitancy and obviously age being one sort of factor. And I think that links us onto the sort of next segment that we wanted to talk about, because obviously one way that we can get out of this pandemic is by taking the vaccine. And although they won't necessarily reduce our risk to zero, they don't necessarily work like that. They all have hopefully high effectiveness levels. Most of the vaccines, according to data, suggest around about 90% effectiveness if you take 2 doses, although data and vaccines are going to change depending on the kind of variants and strains that we see coming and going. This is all the kind of news that we're seeing from other areas of science. But Isaac, I know that you're interested in reasons why people are reluctant to take a vaccine. And obviously, I think one reason might be that people don't see the need because they personally don't see their vulnerability. But I know that particularly you're interested in the kind of conspiracy side of things. There are people that necessarily, is it necessarily the kind of conspiracies about vaccines, or is it conspiracies about kind of COVID-19, or is it a blend of both?
I think it's almost certainly a blend of both. So a lot of the research tends to examine them at similar times because there's always been these narratives of big pharma pushing drugs, pushing vaccines, especially in the US. Over here, we are thankfully, thanks to NHS, to a certain degree, protected from the big pharma conspiracies. But I think they are fundamentally tied to one another. There's some work by Karen Douglas, who is the conspiracy theorist, like Mojo, like they know everything there is to know about the conspiracy theories. So if you want to look up, let's say you had some sort of assignment on conspiracy theories in the future, my first year undergrads I'm thinking of.
Is that a hint?
That's Karen Douglas is the name you want to be looking up. Just as an aside there. But yeah, we get into these bizarre ideas that aren't necessarily harmful ideas about coronavirus and the vaccines. So there are some like funny or positive ones that people have. Because I tend to group them more into like misconceptions or false beliefs around COVID rather than specifically the negative conspiracy theories. So we have things like a positive one is if you hold your breath for 10 seconds, that's a good test of whether or not you have COVID or not. And there was like 10% of a UK sample believed that. So if we were to extrapolate that to the general population, 1 in 10 people are going to believe that holding your breath for long enough is a test of whether or not you have COVID. But then we do get into the more like malicious, harmful things where it is about, control, and it's the government that's seeking to control us. Unfortunately, I don't want to say kinds of people because that implies some sort of causation. As we all know, correlation does not equal causation. But we found in our research, people who had it, and others, we found that a lower score in intelligence, for a lack of a better word, often predicted more negative sentiments towards the vaccine. And other people have found that a lower CRT scores, so cognitive reflection, like we talked about earlier, lower scores on that relate to being more susceptible to misinformation. So that's not to say that people are stupid. It's not tapping into that, are you a smart or dumb person kind of construct. It's more just the way that you think about these problems, I think. COVID vaccination, or vaccination in general, is this counterintuitive process where you go, I'm going to introduce potentially harmful substances into my body to prevent future harmful substances from entering my body. it's very counterintuitive, and there's a lot of cognitive barriers to that. I mean, there's the idea of the omission bias, which is if you're given a decision to make, one that involves action and one that involves doing nothing, you 9 times out of 10 you'll tend towards inaction if the consequences are exactly the same. And a lot of research has identified that as a common underlying factor in omission bias, in vaccine attitudes, that people generally prefer to like wait out and see before they have this injection, which is associated with all these extra risks and costs and things. So yeah, there's this weird network of beliefs, cognitive biases, and personality traits that just inform not only COVID-specific conspiracy theories and vaccine attitudes, but more generally as well. Sorry, that was my soapbox to go on.
No, it was a great soapbox. You should continue on. I mean, you mentioned individual differences. So I was sort of wondering what sort of individual differences. I mean, you mentioned obviously intelligence. That seems to be kind of confounded, as you kind of mentioned, by the fact that people with different levels of intelligence use different kind of reasoning strategies. So I think some people more highly intelligent might rely on analytical, rational thinking versus intuitive, and we kind of mentioned that a little bit sort of earlier. But also individual differences. Something that kind of I'm somewhat aware of from the kind of conspiracy theory literature is that there are certain kind of personality mindsets that really kind of gravitate towards conspiratorial thinking. So I'm thinking sort of things like personal need for structure and need for closure. Those individuals that really like, you know, neatly tied up boxes and bows of how things work in life, when actually, you know, kind of vaccines and all this stuff that we're talking about, COVID-19, it's incredibly complicated. And even as scientists, we don't quite understand everything that's going on. And that's not as appealing as sometimes these conspiracies that kind of promote this, you know, for this kind of evil entity that's driving everything, which provides a much more clearer kind of conceptualization of the world. I don't know if there are any other individual differences that you're aware of.
I mean, there's with conspiracy theories and vaccine attitudes in general, reactants is a pretty good one. So if I was to tell you to do something, you would then respond with like, "Oh, screw you! I'm not going to do what you tell me to do." It's essentially raging against the machine, because it's normally targeted at governments. I think it really taps into the mindset that's a little bit more dominant in America, but it's starting to become more entrenched over here, of that kind of the government is beholden to me, they try and control me, but I'm going to fight back against them with my massive stockpile of guns. In regards to actual personality traits, as in, you know, for example, the big five, let's say, agreeableness is often seen as the opposite of reactance, because reactance is saying, screw you, I'm not going to do it. Agreeableness is, yeah, I'm going to go along with it. You know, I'm just an agreeable person. Agreeableness is quite a reliable predictor of like taking the vaccine, for example, but also is kind of a protective factor against conspiracy theories, because you are kind of going with the kind of the social flow, as it were. You've got things like if someone's more conscientious, that can work both ways. So you can have someone who's more conscientious and pays attention to information to make them less susceptible to conspiracy theories. But at the same time, you can have a conscientious person that also has a pre-existing belief in conspiracy theories. So they kind of align their conscientiousness towards finding information that supports that claim. So that can work both ways. Similarly with openness, you often associate it with like just intelligence, you know, openness to experience, intelligence are kind of intertwined, but you can have openness that backfires, where they're like, I'm a critical thinker, open-minded person, but when I'm given information that supports my existing worldview, I'm more likely to believe that to be the case, which can backfire, as I said, with conspiracy theories and vaccines. Yeah, so there's a few factors at work in personality that are a little bit inconsistent. But I think overall intelligence and trust and things like that are more key predictors.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm getting the sense from what you're saying about these individual differences is that we shouldn't necessarily conclude that, if you're a certain personality type, that means you're, going to adopt conspiratorial. It sounds to be a bit like it depends on other things, just other than your personality. Like, social media is something we often say seems to be a way that these conspiracy theories can take hold. So it might be that, if you're exposed to this sort of conspiracy sort of stuff on maybe your Facebook or social media feed, and you have those kind of personalities, that may be quite conducive. But at the same time, if you have your social media propagating anti-conspiracy theories, so they're kind of telling you more factual information, it might also drive you to the right conclusions as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, but I think that there is also a certain amount of, even before being exposed to things, because that you can go both ways. Like I look at conspiracy theory forums just to see people's thoughts on it, rather than going, oh, this aligns with my attitudes. I definitely think the vaccine's full of 5G or whatever. I think it's potentially just it's difficult to describe. The current COVID crisis, for example, is incredibly politicized in America. So I think it might tap into politically motivated reasoning where you go, okay, this is my pre-existing belief. I'm then going to seek out sources that will confirm it. It's not just if I expose you to conspiracy stuff, it'll eventually brainwash you. I mean, I guess theoretically, if you score lower in critical thinking ability or something like that, you might be more susceptible to that information. But I think it is, most of the time you will go and seek out that information rather than, I'm going to be bombarded with it and be brainwashed by it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. It seems like it's kind of a bit of both worlds. You can come across this, but it also is, you may be kind of motivated to seek out such information as well.
As with every issue in psychology, it's complicated and it's all maybes,
Yeah, and I think that's always the difficulty with psychology as well, is to really come with firm conclusions about very complex things. So let's just move on to our final topic before we conclude for today, which was to talk a little bit about how the pandemic has impacted mental health across the world. So, there's been, anecdotally, documentation of people struggling mental health-wise with lockdowns, isolation being probably two impactful factors, but financial issues as well, I suspect. A lot of people have lost their jobs or, have decreased financial income that have potentially impacted on people's levels of mental health. I believe, Alex, you're familiar with some research looking at how the pandemic may or may even not actually have had such a profound impact on people's mental health levels.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that there are some studies out there that kind of do present this argument that actually the initial lockdown and the pandemic generally has been associated with just this massive increase in mental health symptoms in the population. And I think, those are really important statistics to be aware of it. And because I think that, there have been a lot of negative changes down to the COVID pandemic, but I think that, so the group that I collaborate with who does some work on the sort of COVID and how it's unfolding psychologically, they recently published this paper that actually separated people by different populations. So they had a really large sample, several thousands of people. And they did this analysis where basically, instead of just taking everything at a population level, you separate people by different groups, and then you look at how they change over time. And what they found was that actually, while there were a lot of people who, at the very beginning of lockdown had really high anxiety and have stayed high on anxiety or depression throughout the entire pandemic, actually there's a lot of people who might have been initially high on anxiety, but have quite quickly dropped down to, quite normal, non-clinical levels of anxiety. There have been people who have actually found that they've improved in their mental health symptoms from, the very onset of the pandemic, because actually, they've got a better work-life balance, or, for various factors, they've been able to spend more time with family. So I do think that, using these kind of more complex stats can actually give you a more nuanced perspective on this. And I think actually what that does is it allows us to really identify people who are most at risk of these negative outcomes. So I know that income and your living space are two really big factors that predict high anxiety and depression, and the consistency of that high anxiety and depression. So I think it really sort of highlights the need to really try and put support in place for people that need it the most. and try and make sure that those who are suffering the most get the support that they need.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of what you're saying kind of matches on with some of the research that I've been doing. I was looking at people's levels of depression across the first national lockdown that we had here in the UK, and it sort of gelled with the kind of findings that you were sort of saying, where some people have shown improvements in their mental health, perhaps because they're less stressed about having to take a 2-hour train journey, which is densely packed, especially in London. They get a bit more free time to spend with their children or partners by doing so. But the data that I had sort of showed that depending on people's kind of level of self-esteem, people with very low self-esteem, and self-esteem, for those who are unaware, it's often a very strong marker of those who are likely to be vulnerable to depressive symptomology. So people with low self-esteem particularly were impacted by changes over the course of the national lockdown. So is that kind of similar to what you're kind of finding in your data then?
Yeah. For my understanding, that's very similar. And I think that it's also related to that social support bubble. People that had close-knit families or had family members that were either close by that they could physically distance and see, or people that they could speak to quite often tended to do quite okay during the pandemic, where it was those people who are very isolated and and then had sort of predisposing like risk factors, like low self-esteem, that are the sorts of people that have unfortunately had it worse during the pandemic. And I think that, again, how that changes over time is as another sort of dimension to that as well, is that there are people who have unfortunately got worse and worse as the pandemic's gone on, because for example, changes to their employment situation that might not have improved, and that might have then exacerbated any other risk factors they already had. So yeah, no, absolutely. I think those that's very similar to your research.
Great. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. So what I want to say is thank you both, Alex and Isaac, for your contribution. I think the areas of research that you've been doing sounds fantastic, and I think it's really valuable in terms of how, it illuminates on how psychology can offer something in this crisis. And we've now discussed several different ways in which, psychology can be informative to how people react to the pandemic, as well as how people engage in certain behaviors, and trying to ensure that people uptake that vaccine, which is our way out of this crisis, hopefully, fingers crossed. Although I may look like an idiot in several months' time when this becomes released. But fingers crossed, the vaccine holds up, and those weren't famous last words of this podcast. Okay, thank you both very much. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching the Psychology Debrief. If you have any suggestions for new topics, quizzes, or any other content psychology related, feel free to get in touch via email or Twitter. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Bye!